Okay, AP people, how are we? I wanted to provide this video as a substitution for class notes on the Constitution so you can spend some time doing a little more research on your topic for the project. So let's talk about the Constitution. We'll cover the structure and the analysis of this Constitution. So first, a quick recap. If you remember, during the critical period, the period after the Revolution, under the Articles of Confederation, there are increased calls for a stronger government. Recall the notes we developed in class from the J. Washington and Hamilton documents. Now, this calls for nationalism, for a stronger national government, led to the Annapolis Convention, in which not much happened, and only 5 states sent representatives. Having not enough support at that point, they decided to call for another one in Philadelphia. This happens in 1787, and the goal of this is to revise, to fix the existing government. Now, the goal overall here was to prevent dissolution, the 13 states going their own separate ways, and to prevent chaos from ensuing. And that chaos element really drove, the fear of that came from the Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts. Now, the overall goal of these, who become the framers of this new Constitution here, is to prevent a tyranny of the majority or a mobocracy. The people in the founding fathers represented a specific class of lawyers, merchants, a kind of what they often call the propertied classes, and they feared a tyranny of the majority, kind of rabs and mobs, what they call the faction, taking over and creating chaos. They also feared the tyranny of the minority. They were afraid that if things got too chaotic, that people, just to find some security in life, would want to go back to a king, and this experiment in representative government would be washed. They wanted to prevent a mobocracy, and they wanted to prevent a monarchy on the other end. They also wanted to create economic growth. Remember, after the revolution, the economy was in shambles, and these guys are merchants, but at the same time, everybody thrives and an economy does well. So they want to create a system in which they can encourage short-term and long-term economic growth. And they want to be able to conduct foreign policy and be able to send, one group of people over to represent all of our states united here. And if you recall, Lord Sheffield in England kind of mocked us and said, should I send 13 representatives over because they don't seem to have a unified country? So they wanted a more effective way to conduct foreign policy. And of course, as we're going to see, there's conflicts among states, and they want to prevent future conflict and the actual fighting, if possible, between states. Now, the structure of the new government, as they sit down in Philadelphia to discuss this behind closed doors, one of the things they all agreed with is that the Constitution should create 3 branches, a separation of powers, as they call it. A legislator to make laws, an executive to carry out the laws and defend the laws, and a national judiciary who would decide what these laws meant and whether or not they were okay. This is crucial for you to understand, this comes from the Enlightenment in Europe, specifically by Baron de Montesquieu, who argued that the only way to create a government in which one power will not take over the other power is to have a balance of powers and a separation of powers in the 3 branches. So our 3 branches of government comes from the Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu. Now, they also agreed that the key to stable, effective Republican government was to find a way to balance competing claims of liberty and power. Too much liberty and it's kind of chaos, too much power and nobody has any liberty. So how do we balance between the two? Now, we're talking about a Republican form of government, just to recall. A republic is a state where sovereignty, where power rests with the people or their representatives, rather than with a monarch or an emperor. And this is a country with no monarchy. So we were the first to do this in modern times. So we were trying to get work this out where we could have the people have a say, but make it work. At the constitutional conventions, they want to create this stable republic. 2 major obstacles they faced were this fear of a strong central government. Remember, we're coming off the revolution and the grievances against an all-powerful England. That was the fact that we had no say. So they feared a strong central government. However, the issues during the critical period begin to make people think maybe some sort of central government would be good for stability. It's also a little bit farther away from the battle over the Stamp Act and everything now, about 20 years on. So people begin to kind of forget that initial passion and fear. We also have the conflicting claims and needs of small states and large states, and the northern interests and southern interests. And of course, these are going to continue, particularly the northern versus southern interests are going to be a problem throughout much of our history and don't really get resolved until the Civil War is concluded. And some even argue that today this is still an issue. And keep in mind, people who were meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, they agreed to scrap the whole entire Articles of Confederation, but they weren't supposed to do that. It was assumed they were going in to amend, to fix the Articles. Behind the closed doors, without going back and consulting anybody to their states, they agreed to scrap them. Some have termed this a revolution or almost a coup d'etat, where they've seized power among these people here because of the nature of the way they did that. Okay. So some solutions offered to create this new government was the large states and the small states. Now, the large states were represented by James Madison, particularly Virginia, and they wanted the proportional representation, basically two houses in the legislature, where the state's population determined how much you had in both houses, how many people you had in the house. Now, the New Jersey or Paterson Plan, also known as the small state plan, because it didn't have as much people, they wanted a one-house legislature in which each state would have one vote. That would be more favorable to a smaller state because it would give them equal say and power to larger, more populous states. The compromise they worked out, which is known as the Great Compromise, is where you have a Congress with two legislative houses, a Senate with two senators from each state, no matter how big you are, and a House of Representatives with one representative for every 30,000 people that live there. So this would be more favorable to the larger states because you'd have more reps based on population. So the federal Constitution creates a new type of government. Let's look at the old versus the new. So the Articles was a Confederate form of government. Most of the power was within individual states. They had the sovereignty. It reflected a distrust that many people had over a strong central government. There was no executive power and very limited national authority. The central authority was virtually non-existent. Federalism that the Constitution creates is a union of states under a stronger central government. States control most of your local issues. There's local government, and each state can do that. We still do that. The Constitution, however, has supremacy over the states, and the state laws and decisions cannot counter the federal Constitution. Now, defining where states' rights and national power lie, that is where we even still have questions and controversy today. It's this tricky balance between local and central power that still goes on today. Now, what powers did the new Constitution have? The new government under the national Constitution was able to collect taxes. They were not able to do it. They could directly collect taxes from people. They could make treaties with foreign powers, and every state had to live up to this. They were able to maintain an army and a navy, and they could do this because they could collect taxes from individuals and pay for the army. They could coin and borrow money, which is also very crucial for keeping a government running. They were able to regulate commerce among states with foreign powers. And again, if Massachusetts and New York, or as commonly often happened, New Jersey and New York City, if they would have just a debate about who controlled commerce on the Hudson River, the national government could step in and make that decision. That was often done in the form of judicial cases by the federal judiciary, Supreme Court. The new government, the new Constitution, had something called the Elastic Clause. Think of elastic as sort of stretchy. You can kind of stretch it to do certain things. The Elastic Clause stated that the Congress could make laws necessary and proper to carry out its powers. So whatever is not in the Constitution, as long as it was necessary and proper for the government to carry out its powers, they could pass this law. This becomes extremely controversial. You're going to see in the future, Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonians, they believe in a strict construction of the Constitution. And what that meant is if it didn't say you could do it in the Constitution, the federal government cannot do it. But many people who believe in the Elastic Clause say, no, look, the Elastic Clause says that it says we can make any laws that are, quote, necessary and proper to carry out our powers. This becomes the wiggle room with which the federal government can do things that aren't in the Constitution, but it's very, very controversial. It also creates, for the first time, a president, an executive branch that whole branch is represented by one person. It also creates a judicial branch to arbitrate over legal issues. And again, the legislative Congress branch, the executive president branch, and the judicial branch all have equal powers. And one is not allowed to have more power than the other, which is to prevent one from having too much power. The Constitution creates an amendment process in which you don't have to have complete unanimity to pass any changes. But it's hard to do it, but you can do it. And so we've had 27 amendments since the Constitution, and this allows for enough room for changing times to adapt. Now, some argue, and some of you are dealing with this in your projects, that this was a kind of conservative step back from the liberty and revolutionary values of the Declaration of Independence, and that it in fact limited democracy. And they say the following: that who could vote for president and for elections was left up to the states. So if states wanted to have high property qualifications in order to vote, they were allowed to do that. This kept a lot of people disenfranchised, unable to vote. So they had no say. It also they believed in limited democracy. Many of them feared the excess of democracy. Democracy often is used as a bad word among the founders because it means like pure democracy, where even the uneducated rabble have a say. And so you can read these documents during the time they were writing letters to each other, where they're fearful of too much democracy. And when you look at the structure of the government, right, we have only one half of 1/3 of the government was directly elected by the people, the House of Representatives. The president was elected by an electoral college, which was appointed by legislatures. The Senate was appointed by state senators, there's a filter between the people. And the only branch that had actual people voted for were the House of Representatives. And so what you have is, yes, the power is originating from the people, but really only one branch had a portion of it that was directly elected by the people. Federal judges, they're appointed by the president, so that's, the people aren't voting for them. And as I said before, the president will be elected by an electoral college. Now, another key element to our Constitution is the division and separation of powers. I know I went over this. I want to emphasize this again. This is Montesquieu, a French Enlightenment thinker's idea. The Constitution embodies federalism and a system of checks and balances. Federalism refers to, and I want to put it in writing here, federalism refers to the relationship between the national government and the states. And this is going to be continuously a problem throughout U.S. history. Where does this balance lie? Now, again, separation of powers or checks and balances, you're going to hear this a lot throughout the year, probably on the AP exam. This refers to the way the Constitution seeks to prevent any branch of the national government from dominating the other two. All right, and I want to just kind of have an enlightenment page here because this is a big element. It's one of the key standards of AP US history, which means you're going to get a question on it. Two thinkers that really had a big influence on American politics. John Locke, English, 1600s, wrote the two treatises of government. Big thing, he argues about people have natural rights. This is the first time really people say this, and he says natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And I bolded property here because if you remember, Jefferson borrows some of this for the Declaration of Independence, but he changes it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke was talking about property, and the Constitution very much protects property rights. It also talks about the consent of the governed. This is where the government rules with the people's permission, the governed permission. And again, like I said in the previous slide, some argue that people don't have a lot of direct say, but the idea is that the power originally comes from elected representatives. Now, Locke said that if the government becomes destructive of our rights and starts to impede on our rights, it is the people's job to overthrow it if necessary. Jefferson states that explicitly in the Declaration of Independence. But remember, the Declaration of Independence is not a government document. It was our letter to England and the world and the colonists. Hey, we're declaring independence. Here's why we think we should be able to do this. It did not set up a structure of government. The actual government, the Constitution, says nothing about overthrowing the government. On the one hand, though, it does leave the amendment process, so we could argue that if we need to fix things, if our rights are being hindered, we could fix the Constitution. And then again, the Baron de Montesquieu, he wrote The Spirit of Laws, and this advocated a system of checks and balances, a separation of powers, and specifically he mentions 3 branches of government. And he thought that dividing power among branches would help prevent government abuse. You guys will definitely learn more about this in government class. Now, many of you are dealing with the question, whose Constitution is this? Who did this work for? If you think about it, right, women, African Americans, Indians, and poor whites really were kind of left out of this. They were excluded from voting, they were excluded from educational opportunities, and they were excluded from property ownership in almost every single case. The Constitution did nothing to fix this or amend this, even though many of them did play a role in the Revolution. Now, if I'm being being a cynic, I would look at that first stuff. Being optimistic, I would say, well, look, the Constitution did allow for improvements over time. If you look at the amendment process, it left room for the fight to keep fighting on, and eventually women, African Americans, and everybody all, get the right to vote. You could debate, though, how this happened and how effective it changed these people's lives, and I think it would be different for each group, and we'll explore that in your Liberty Forum that we're going to have soon. Quickly, recent analysis of the Constitutional Convention, what's called the Consensus School of Historians, they argued that, look, as contentious as it got debating this Constitution, those who crafted the Constitution did agree. They had a consensus on certain things. Economically, they all agreed that we need to have a sound money system. It limited paper money, printing of paper currency. This favors creditors, those who are lending money. They tend to be the ones with money. It protected private property. States time and time again would try to pass laws that would limit private property or maybe distribute private property or limit what you could do on your private property. And it was always struck down because it violated private property rights. And the Constitution protects private property rights. Politically, it called for a stronger government, and they all agreed with that. And you saw that in your letter. We need a stronger government. We saw a stronger government from class. It created a system of checks and balances, and there wasn't really much debate about that. They all agreed on that. And they all agreed that there should be manhood suffrage. Now, I didn't put universal manhood suffrage because, again, not all, but many believed you had to own a bit of property, because if you had property, you had a stake in what goes on in your community, and therefore you'd vote responsibly. It tended, though, to favor the wealthier. And most of them, when you read their notes to each other, they feared what they called the mob. And this was represented in the fact that they only gave the regular people voting rights to vote for the House of Representatives. Again, that's only 1/2 of a third of the government. And I think Alexander Hamilton sums the idea here pretty well when he says, all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct, permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second. And as they cannot receive any advantage by change, they therefore will ever maintain good government. If you think about this, what he's saying is, look at the rich and well-born. They're not going to want to change anything because they got a good thing going. So therefore, they'll vote to keep things the way they are, which favors them, but it also keeps a stable system. As you can see, if you're a lower class person, this is very insulting, and it also deprives you of many rights. Now, for your homework, okay, I want you to look at the two views of the people in this debate. What ends up happening after the Constitution is written, it had to be ratified or agreed to by 9 states. There were very extensive debates between Federalists who supported the Constitution and Anti-Federalists who opposed a strong central government. And so each state had to have a vote, and then 9 states had a vote in favor of the Constitution. Now, for homework, you're going to read some documents from the New York Constitution Ratification Convention in June of 1787, which was from the most heated, debated of all states. So every state had a debate as to whether they should join this. The notes you're going to read are from the convention in New York, where they tried to decide should New York ratify the Constitution. So you're going to read a handout, or the letter is by Alexander Hamilton, who is a Federalist, and Melanchthon Smith, who is an Anti-Federalist. Please read those, fill out the graphic organizer, and do this. Keep in mind, what types of governments did these two want? Complete the graphic organizer. Consider, you don't have to write this down or anything, but consider what are these two basic positions. And I gave you sort of a cheat sheet on the backside of your graphic organizer. And also, do we still see versions of these issues being played out today? Just so you know, for what it's worth, the New York, after this convention, they ended up ratifying or agreeing to the Constitution by a vote of 30 to 27. This was the narrowest margin of victory of any state that met in 1787 and 88. The Anti-Federalists lost the battle but won the war. And what I mean by that is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were a Bill of Rights. And these were ratified in 1791. And these addressed many of the issues that the Anti-Federalists raised in these conventions. So we'll talk more about the Bill of Rights when we get there. But right now, I'd like you to keep in mind what the Constitution stood for, and then what did the Federalists say about it, why they like it, and what about the Anti-Federalists. Okay, good luck.